So, do you remember that PlayStation 4 exclusive that everyone just kind of forgot about? No, not those ones. The one with the weird werewolf creatures? No, not that one. It's set in like an old steampunk London town. No, different one. The one where you play as a thick mustachioed sweetheart. There you go. So, announced back in 2013, the Order 1886 was hyped up a lot, and it had good reason to be. I mean, the concept and world alone was so fucking cool. It seemed to have really endearing and well-designed characters, and the game looked gorgeous, and everything about it seemed really promising. I mean, we hadn't seen actual gameplay yet, but I mean, this was 2013, we were still pretty stupid back then. Hype kept building for the game, and people were excited. There were some delays leading up to it, but not nearly as bad as the shit we have to deal with as gamers today. And this was 2013. The new consoles were new and scary. We weren't really sure yet about their potential and what they could really do, power they had or anything. And one thing that always helps a new console is a really polished, good-looking exclusive. And I think Sony were really hoping this was going to be a heavy hitter for them, but... Drop it! And I'm guessing that they originally wanted it for a launch title, or at least close to launch, but they realized that they only had a cinematic trailer and maybe some demo builds, so ended up pushing it back quite a bit. So eventually 2015 rolled around, and the game was finally released. There wasn't too much marketing leading up to it. It got pretty mixed reviews, sold decently, and that was that. People just kind of forgot about it and moved on. They went back to playing their Black Ops 3s and Fallout 4s, Toe Jam and Earls, or their Hatsune Miku softly stuttering and saying I love you simulator 2015. Life just went on, but I think it's pretty important to look back and learn from our past, our mistakes, and the Order is definitely a weird, forgotten part of our past as gamers. It certainly wasn't a bad game. The complaints about it were just too glaring to ignore, and it ended up leaving kind of a sour taste in a lot of players' mouths. So I originally wanted to split this video up into kind of a good and bad stuff, but the problem with this game is that every aspect of it is kind of a mixed bag. I'd end up talking about everything twice. So the first and most notable complaint the game got is that it was 6 hours long. Barely. And yeah, this pretty much was the biggest flaw that every media outlet pointed out at the time, and I can't disagree. The playtime. This is a complaint that games have gotten and will continue to get for as long as games are being made. Recent examples are stuff like Resident Evil 3, Jedi Fallen Order, Metal Gear Solid Ground Zero, Blair Witch, Man of Medan. The list just goes on. Fortunately for us, more often than not, games are the opposite. They're too long. Looking at you, Rockstar. And both are issues, but when a game is too short, the audience ends up feeling cheated. I mean, you spent probably £40 on the game, and it should feel like it. Movies have it easy. As long as you hit 1.5 hours, you're golden, and in most cases, you're gonna get more critics the longer you get. But gamers, well, gamers have stamina. I don't disagree. You absolutely deserve a full gaming experience for the price you pay. But some people go into these cinematic games with pretty gross misconceptions of what they're getting out of it. Do you want 60 plus hours of shit like this? Or a short, concise and polished experience? I know that you can have an in-between, obviously. There are numerous examples of that, but certain games are meant to be short cinematic experiences, and this isn't an exception. But again, I still don't disagree. The game is really fucking short for what it is, and it could have and should have been longer. And the story really dictated this, as if it was meant to be the first episode of a TV series. But sometimes you have deadlines and sacrifices that have to be made, usually out of the control of the creative team. I'm not defending the playtime, I'm just seeing the reason behind it. And I don't mind a game being short, but if you were planning on getting this game, get it when it's the cheapest you possibly fucking can. Because this game has the replay value of one of those foam dinosaurs that inflates when you put them in water. None of the collectibles are worthwhile, they don't really add anything to the world building, besides a kinda cool Sackboy plushie. And there's so few of them here that I ended up getting the platinum trophy for the game without even realising it. There are long-ass cutscenes, and you couldn't skip them in the game at launch, and since I was actually trying to pay attention to the story when I replayed it, I never tested out if you could, so if you were planning on just skipping them and going right to the action parts of the game, well, I don't know, good luck with that, I guess. The game doesn't have any kind of multiplayer, which is a huge shame because the mechanics would make it perfect for a Gears of War type co-op survival mode, but because they put all their resources into random water textures running off lamps, we don't get any of that kind of stuff that would, be actually fun. QuickTime events. Oh boy, will QuickTime events never not get hate? And do I hate it? Yeah, kinda, but in a story-based game like this, it kinda works. It adds tension and interactivity to what would be just another cinematic sequence. Insert an Angry Joe clip. Obviously, ideally, you would want to play through the entire game with as few limited sections as possible, but this just realistically isn't that possible. In this game, they tend to go on really long, and they are pretty simplistic, all things considered. They definitely could have added more interesting mechanics into the game. I really appreciate the way that the Telltale games have countered this, adding little things like moving cursor parts and this kind of stuff. It just makes it feel more dynamic, like the player actually has a part in the game beyond just pressing a button when it tells you to. So the story. So a little introduction to the story. In a semi-futuristic steampunk London, there is a Knights of the Round Table who defend the city from monsters and humans. They rejuvenate themselves with a thing called the Black Water, which they get from the Fountain of Youth. And they use pretty dope-ass technology made by Nikola Tesla to fight the evil. And in the game, you play as the Knight Galahad, who begins to unravel deeper mysteries behind the history of the group and the recent rise in some weird paranormal shit that's been going on in Whitechapel, including the Jack the Ripper murders. I'm not going to go into it too much because I think it's worth experiencing yourselves. A lot of people thought that the story was really bland and just a bunch of exposition, and frankly, I just kind of disagree. I'm personally a sucker for medieval fantasy shit, and however, the way the player interacts with the story is pretty poor. The Last of Us 1 and 2 kind of mastered this through a combination of limited cutscenes, optional and in-game dialogue, and really well realized notes and artifacts that flesh out the world and even create their own side stories. This is the kind of stuff the Order really needed, and it's such a shame because the world really offers us a lot in terms of possibilities. You could have the characters living among the rebels and the Lycan, learning about other knights in the group, but we don't really get any of that. It's very surface level. It is Galahad's story, and that is it. There's plenty of games that don't need realistic looking graphics or anything to tell a really immersive and interesting story in a really engaging world. Look at games like Dejana, Indivisible, or even Undertale. These are games that accomplish all of this, and don't have the benefit of being a large development team with a AAA budget. They just put a lot more thought and ability into telling the story through gameplay. It doesn't help that the game only takes place over a matter of a couple of days, and just as the story really feels like it's getting going, Galahad ends up in a coma, and after that there's not even an hour left of the game. This just leaves the player feeling really empty, in an oh, that's it kind of way. Like I said, everything it sets up is really cool and interesting to the audience, but it never gets explored. And it baffles me that it never got a sequel, or even spin-offs like comics or anything. A lot of people could look at this game and call it a walking simulator mixed up with some combat moments, and they wouldn't be wrong, but that's a very simplistic way of looking at the game, and I think it deserves a bit better than that. Not a lot, but a bit. Because the game is really built to be kind of a lead-in to a sequel, it got a really lukewarm response, and that made players feeling kind of empty, like they didn't really get what they paid for, therefore it didn't get a sequel, which is kind of sad, but it's a good lesson to other developers. So what about the combat? The real essence of the gameplay. The downside is that it's just kind of generic. It's not bad, and definitely doesn't feel unpolished or anything like that, and all the different weapons you get throughout the game feel really good, and all feel super unique to shoot and how you use them. But besides that, the game developer Ready at Dawn really didn't innovate or try anything different. I can sense from the game director in interviews that they had much greater expectations for the game and wanted to have a lot more diversity and range to the combat, but were pretty limited by time and budget and everything. But hey, I don't know, that's just a random assumption. It's like Minecraft combat. It's fun when you have to do it, but it gets extremely repetitive when you have to do it for any extended period of time. But at least Minecraft also has the added benefit of the combat most likely not being the reason you bought the game. The upside of the gameplay is that it's tight. It feels really good to shoot fuckers in this game. The controls are snappy, responsive, and it feels fair as far as a third-person shooter goes. I'm surprised it isn't brought up more often as an example of how to make a really tight, compact shooter. Like I said, all the weapons in the game are different and unique, and they feel it. An example is at one point you get a weapon that shoots thermite pellets, and you have to shoot a flare at it to ignite it. This is really cool, and it's great to see a game get creative with some of its weapons and how they change the way that you tackle enemies. There's a rifle that you get that shoots a wave of air that staggers enemies, and you can use this in a few different ways, and it's really fun. I really like this kind of stuff. But again, even though there's differences between all the weapons and they all feel really cool, there's just not enough of them. This game isn't a high-octane, pump-through action all the time. The game really slows down the pace and allows you to walk through the world and explore, and find random scraps of paper on the ground. The game is not for Angry Joe type gamers who want to hack and slash and rip and tear. It's more of a Gone Home, but over-the-shoulder shooter, minus the interesting notes that flesh out the world. Also, the final boss fight in the game is just kinda lame. Because the game is so short, it feels really anticlimactic, and there's just not enough build up to the main villain. It's not even that the main villain is bad, it's actually a really cool idea in my opinion, but we haven't spent enough time with the characters to really develop a truly meaningful connection between them and Galahad, and the fight itself is just a rehash of something we did earlier in the game, which was cool, but doing it again? The game is really cinematic. One thing when this game was coming out was that it was going to run at 30 FPS, which isn't really a big deal now. This is actually pretty much the standard for console games, but they'd even wanted to go for 24 frames a second, but surprise surprise, that doesn't feel good to play, which of course it doesn't. Remember when The Hobbit released at 50 frames per second, and people fucking hated it because it didn't look good. It didn't look like a film, the same way that 24 frames doesn't look or feel like a video game. But The Hobbit also has the benefit of being a really accessible and easy to engage with story that The Order just isn't. But luckily they ended up sticking with the 30 frames per second, which I think looks fine. I've never been a member of the PC Master Race, so having a super high frame rate really isn't important to me, and just doesn't bother me. But it's something to keep in mind if you care about this kind of stuff, I suppose. Going back to The Last of Us, the game is really reminiscent of it, in terms of its playstyle and traversal with how you move about the world. You really feel like a tangible character in the world with real weight and purpose. Everything is on point, including the sound design, the visual effects, and the animations are just fantastic. To make it feel more authentic, they even added a layer of nasty old film grain, which is the kind of thing a shitty student film would do when they forgot to set up lighting and framing properly, in an attempt to salvage a passing grade. I would know, I've done that a lot. You just put it under the pretense of some shit like, oh, it's to fit the time period, or oh, it was a conscious aesthetic decision. And those decisions may sound good in your head, but in a game when they actually disregard your ability to play the game by not being able to see the enemy because of film scratches, then you need to rethink your priorities. The Order 1886 is like an e-girl who dresses like Ramona Flowers and has a Vine quote as her Twitter bio. It may sound appealing, but when you get to know it, you realise there's no actual depth there. That sounds like an insult, because it is, but that's also a large part of the reason I enjoyed playing the game. At the moment, all the biggest games coming out tend to be Ubisoft-style open-world games with dozens of systems that don't intersect, and you have to learn and level up individually. The Order has quite literally none of this. There is nothing you need to think about in this game beyond trying to understand what the fuck is happening in the story and trying not to get your mustache shot off by some dirty, jumped-up Millwall fan.
Gonna be today.
It's gonna be 1-0, Will Grigg on the chicks, come on!
The game really allows you to sit back and take it easy when it wants you to, until, for example, you run into one of the 2 horror sections that have all the scare value of a Michael Jackson music video that isn't Thriller, because that shit was actually scary. I don't want to sound too harsh on these sections because they do a really good job of building tension and they really utilize well done art direction, but most of the parts that are meant to be scary, the player's only involvement is holding the joystick up, which removes any of the adrenaline rush you would get from playing a game like Outlast or Alien Isolation, where it relies on player interactivity to build that tension. Although gameplay wise, these are still some of the most diverse that the game has to offer, like this section where you fight a Lycan hand to hand. And while it's just a glorified QTE, it breaks up the gameplay loop really well. Or this section where you have to stealthily break into an estate manor, Again, it's just much more interesting than the rest of the game. These are mechanics that could have just been developed more and added into the base combat of the game. So if you couldn't tell, I kind of go back and forth on this game. There's aspects that definitely shine, but bring it down at the same time. It has really cool visuals and is still one of the best looking games on the PS4, but that's still mixed in with really generic QTEs. It has really tight cover-to-cover shooting, but it gets kind of repetitive. Should you play it? Well, yeah. If you can get the game on sale, you can probably get it for like a $5 on the PlayStation Store at some point, because it's still a really well-made, concise experience of a game. But just know going into it that that's all it is. So, looking back at a lot of the reviews from the time, the game averaged pretty much 6 out of 10 across the board. And frankly, I have to agree. It's not a masterpiece by any means. It's just that everything about it is a double-edged sword. Everything is a sacrifice of creative ideas and intentions for the polished and refined gaming experience that I keep talking about. But really, there shouldn't be any need for this kind of compromise. But that's kind of a whole other issue within the gaming industry, with crunch and everything that fucking Naughty Dog are doing.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
And that about does it. I'm hoping to make this a series, kind of just looking at forgotten games. So let me know if you want to see more of it. I have a few ideas for other games I could talk about. And let me know if you want to see any particular genres or era of gaming. Or let me know if you hated this and you want to pour boiling milk on my face because it was just that boring. So, peace.